Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today, we continue our series at Petrified Forest National Park as I'm joined by park ranger and biologist Dylan Schneider. Dylan and I chat a whole lot about prairie dogs and the incredible impact they have on the petrified forest landscape. We also talk about bats and the amazing acoustic monitoring program that occurs right here at this national park. And finally, we talk about one of the most fascinating mammals in all of North America, the pronghorn. Dylan, we are at beautiful Petrified Forest National Park. You are a park ranger and biologist here. What was your journey like to the National Park Service, and why biology for you?
As a kid, I had this instinctual draw to nature and being outside. My mom likes to tell a story that when we moved to Pennsylvania when I was 2 years old, it just happened to be the year of the 17-year cicada hatch. And she would catch me outside as a 2-year-old just standing there letting the cicadas climb up my legs and sticking the shells all over, myself and the dog. And, just kind of always had this question of why is nature the way it is? And so from there, going through, high school, just drawn to the biology classes. It wasn't really until college that I thought of having biology as a career. One of the big draws was just being outside all the time and being able to work outside and answer some of those questions of why did things happen, And then I ended up in grad school in Pennsylvania looking at salamander communities and seeing the effects of different logging practices in forests and how they impacted salamanders. And then I had, in between grad school and undergrad, I had an SCA internship, which is a great program that gets youth involved in some of these conservation topics and jobs. And I worked in Moab looking at amphibians in canyonlands and the surrounding areas. And so that really tied me into the Park Service as a entity of, a job you can work for and the kinds of conservation that they do. And then after grad school, my advisor actually had worked with a biologist in Yellowstone. And so through that connection, I got a job in Yellowstone looking at amphibians. And I was a seasonal in Yellowstone for 12 years, working on the wildlife health program, looking at zoonotic diseases across a lot of different species. And then I moved to bear management program, working with human wildlife interactions, before I moved to Petrified Forest about 4 years ago as the permanent biologist.
As a biologist, when you're studying bears in a place like Yellowstone and then come to Petrified Forest, can you find links between behaviors from a completely different species like a bear and then maybe how, a prairie dog interacts with this environment? Do such drastic landscape changes, can they help inform different behaviors that you might see as a biologist?
Yeah, and I think in biology, there's a couple major driving factors, right? You always need food, you always need water, you always need shelter. And so the different aspects of how species get those things might be very different, but it's always those couple defining factors of what drives their behavior.
So as people can see on camera, the Badlands of Petrified Forest are behind us. What is the ecosystem that exists here? I think the initial perception of folks before they arrive here is that they're entering a forest and they're going to see large trees, but that's not necessarily the case. So what is the ecosystem that exists here?
Yeah, so the current ecosystem of Petrified Forest is a dry grassland habitat. We're at 5,000 feet elevation, give or take, on the southern end of the Colorado Plateau. And we're mostly desert grassland, short grass, prairie, depending on how you define it. We get about 10 inches of rain average a year, so kind of right on that cusp of desert. That grassland is interspersed with the clay badlands like you can see behind us, as well as some sand dune ecosystem scattered about. And then we do have a little bit of pinyon juniper forest, which you can actually see back behind us too.
When people arrive here, they hear a lot about paleontology, fossils that exist here, of course, the fossilized petrified wood that exists in the park. But the reality is there's a whole lot of life that lives back in the environment behind us and all around us. What kind of life does this ecosystem harbor?
So yeah, as you touched on, 200 million years ago, this petrified forest would have been located near the equator, and it would have been a very different ecosystem full of swamps or a river and 200-foot tall trees. But over the course of that time frame, the continents have shifted northward, and we have dried out into the desert grasslands that we see today. Even though it doesn't look as productive as a lot of national parks like Yellowstone, where you see these large above ground trees and biomass, petrified forest is a fairly productive environment. But like most deserts, it's hard to see because species have evolved strategies to live in a very dry place and a very hot place. So in order to see a lot of animals, they come out at night and they're very cryptic. They've changed body sizes, so a lot of the reptiles and amphibians are smaller and harder to spot across the landscape. And then some of them also have become seasonal, where they'll migrate in and out of the park.
Are there species that hibernate in the park? We woke up this morning and it was in the 20s here.
Yeah.
We're in the desert. It's warm during the day. It's very cold at night. So are there species that go underground and hibernate seasonally?
Yeah, that's one of the main strategies for animals here. Believe it or not, our prairie dogs actually are one of the couple species that hibernate through the winter. Hibernation being a loose term of biologic definition. A lot of our reptiles and amphibians will go into an estivation or hibernation through the winter to survive the dry period. And then some of our bats will migrate or hibernate just to get through either weather, lack of water, or lack of food. So as insects die down, there's not as much food for some species, so they'll go into an estivation to be able to survive.
That was going to be my next question, is for carnivores here that hunt the smaller mammals, if they're burrowing underground and hibernating for months, do the larger megafauna, do they migrate away and search for food if everything is underground here?
Yeah, and so again, that varies depending on what you're talking about. A lot of our raptors that hunt rabbits and small mammals will leave. We'll also get different ones coming in from the north to spend the winter here. Things like harriers, we have a lot more of in the winter than the summer. But also our small mammal community doesn't all disappear. So we have rabbits all year round. On warm afternoons, you can find lizards year round, and you can find antelope ground squirrels. So there is still prey for things like coyotes that don't migrate. But yeah, it's kind of a variable. If everything had the same ecological niche, we'd only have one species. So having all these different little micro differences is what creates these more biodiverse areas.
We've teased it a couple of times, but I want to talk about the prairie dog because there is a special conservation story going on here of restoring them into this environment. Why are prairie dogs being restored here?
Yeah, so prairie dogs, or the prairie dog program, is one of our big projects here in Petrified Forest. The overall end goal of the program would be to be able to reintroduce black-footed ferrets into the park. In the state of Arizona, there's a big black-footed ferret reintroduction program. They've already been released in a couple different spots, and we have been designated as one of those potentials. Of course, that depends on a lot of factors. Being a national park, it's a lot more protected than some of the other areas, private land and such. But the black-footed ferrets are obligate prairie dog predators. So over 90% of a black-footed ferret's diet is prairie dogs. So in order to have a healthy black-footed ferret population, you need prairie dogs. So our restoration effort is aimed towards being able to reintroduce black-footed ferrets.
And the prairie dog specific species that you're restoring here is the Gunnison's prairie dog. What's the difference between the Gunnison's prairie dog and maybe other prairie dogs that you might see around the U.S.?
Yeah, so there's 5 different prairie dog species in the U.S. They're specific to North America, so you don't find them anywhere else in the world. And the one everyone thinks of is the black-tailed prairie dog. It ranges basically from Canada to Mexico, and is one of the more readily observed species. The big difference between the black-tailed prairie dog and the Gunnison's prairie dog is it does not hibernate through the winters. So even though it lives in places like Montana where they get a ton of snow, it's out and active all year round. There's also the white-tailed prairie dog, the Utah prairie dog, which is a, I believe, endangered species, and the Mexican prairie dog. The Gunnison prairie dog, however, is centered around basically the Four Corners region, so Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, which we're basically in the heart of right here.
You mentioned earlier that this is a grassland. Why are prairie dogs vital for the health of grasslands?
Yeah, so prairie dogs have evolved in grasslands, so they've kind of evolved together, right? Prairie dogs like living in grasslands because they're a very predator-orientated species. They're a communal organism who help protect each other. Most people think of them as popping out of their holes and chirping and warning each other that maybe a hawk's flying over. So most of the species of prairie dogs like having these broad, open view plains where they can see a hawk or a coyote coming in from as far away as possible. In the other sense, prairie dogs have helped the grasslands in a couple different ways. So they provide these burrow systems that actually help the plants in the environment. So it provides aeration to the soils and kind of soil turnover and nutrient cycling. It also helps with water retention. So a lot of times when we get rain here, it's monsoonal rain system, and we'll get a couple inches in a day, 1 to 3 inches in a day. And the ground just can't absorb that. So it runs off very quickly and is gone and not being able to be used by the plants. Having all these burrows in the ecosystem actually allows water to pool down them and absorb into the soil over a longer time frame. These burrows also provide many other species in the park habitat. So things like rattlesnakes, which will eat prairie dogs, also live in the burrows. There's numerous bird species. The most obvious one is the burrowing owl that lives in the burrows with next door to the prairie dogs that dig them, and are pretty much reliant on their burrows in this ecosystem to live. We also have a lot of other small animals, such as lizards use them. A lot of insects you'll find more often in prairie dog colonies, and things like the tiger salamander will go down the burrows to live. Prairie dogs also have a big impact on the grass species here. So most people think that they'll eat all the plant and it just gets rid of the grass or whatever plant they're eating. But they actually just trim the top bit of it, which actually stimulates the plant to grow more. And there might be less biomass, but it's more nutrients in that biomass. So it's actually good for species like pronghorn. And you'll find them more often in prairie dog colonies than you would expect.
Earlier, you had mentioned that the prairie dog is a keystone species, and for those who are unfamiliar, essentially a keystone species is vital for an environment to be able to thrive. You had mentioned the prairie dog program is to bring back the black-footed ferret, but the reality is if the prairie dog didn't exist here at all, there'd be adverse effects around the park beyond just the black-footed ferret not existing here, correct?
Correct, yeah. And right now, our prairie dog population is pretty low. We can get into that in a bit. And we are seeing some potential changes from that. So some negative impacts of, just habitat changes in what plant species are around. We are seeing a shrubification for various reasons of the grasslands, and some of that may be attributed to lack of prairie dogs.
Everything you described, in a way, kind of reminds me of how vital a beaver might be to, a forest landscape and engineering, riparian areas. Can a prairie dog kind of be equated to a beaver in this type of environment?
So keystone species can all be attributed to having a major impact on their ecosystem. Beavers obviously have a very visual change from a above ground to an aquatic ecosystem, right? So prairie dogs aren't that obvious, but they do have significant benefits to the grasslands. It's just not as obvious to us as humans.
You had mentioned that we could talk about the low populations of prairie dogs currently in the park. Is that the reason why black-footed ferrets aren't in the park yet?
So black-footed ferrets, again, are obligate prairie dog consumers. So in order to support a healthy black-footed ferret population, we need a certain size population for prairie dogs. Right now in the state of Arizona, the plan says we need about 5,500 acres of contiguous prairie dog habitat to support a population of black-footed ferrets that would survive, which I think is about 20 family units. Right now, we're not anywhere close to that, unfortunately, but we do have that potential to reach that, so we're trying to get there. Unfortunately, the populations here have experienced a major decrease for various reasons. So when the West was settled, the prairie dog was originally described as this major impedance to settlement of the West. So things like in the early 1900s, they were said to compete with the cattle in the ranching industry. And so they were villainized and poisoned, and I've seen different metrics of around 60% or more, maybe up to 90% of prairie dogs throughout the West have actually been killed. So we are on this small bit of habitat left, that, or the range that they live in left in the West. And we're still seeing lasting effects of that vilification. So we always hear stories about cows or horses breaking their legs in prairie dog burrows. It's always, somebody I know's horse broke their leg, but everybody doesn't like the prairie dogs because of that. So hunting pressure is still a major source of mortality in prairie dog populations. In a national park, they're protected, so we don't have that in the park, but are just outside our borders. The shift in weather patterns, so we're getting less rain, which reduces the forage amount for them, and so we're seeing some impact from that. Yeah, and so the last major impact to prairie dog populations across the West is, of course, plague. So sylvatic plague, the same species thought to have caused the Black Death in Europe, was brought over probably by rats during the early colonization. The prairie dog colonies, as well as the black-footed ferrets, don't have any natural resistance to the disease. And as it comes through, it can wipe out 90% or more of a prairie dog population. And so those are the major impacts we see in the park. I think as recently as maybe 5 years ago, we had plague in the park and knocked the populations down pretty good.
What's the management plan when you recognize that the plague is in the park? How do you maneuver around that?
Ideally, we don't. We put a lot of effort into preventing it from having a big outbreak to begin with. So one of the big projects every summer we do is actually mitigate for fleas. And that's shifted a couple different ways since I've been here. There's a vaccine that was developed with kind of so-so results that would protect the prairie dogs actually from the disease. Otherwise, we're looking at treating the fleas. which are what actually transmit the bacteria. And so for a while we were actually spraying insecticides in the burrows. It was called a delta dust or a delmethrin treatment. We have shifted a year or two ago to a new treatment medication as opposed to a pesticide that we're helping develop with USGS and Fish and Wildlife called a Fitbit. So it's a fipronil treatment similar to what you give your pets, a dog or a cat. However, it's just a pellet that we throw down in the colonies and they eat it. And it's looking like it has pretty good results, a little bit longer lasting than the delmethrin had, and easier and cheaper to distribute.
You talked about the vilification of prairie dogs. Do you think that's also just a byproduct of being classified as a rodent? It seems like anytime something is named a rodent, there's automatic vilification that's aimed towards that species.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, that's part of it. Yeah, rodents are seen as, dirty animals that transmit diseases. And like we just talked about, they do transmit diseases, and it is a real threat. But the simple way to avoid it is don't bother them, right? Don't go around, try to pick them up, or not only can they bite you, but numerous animals, rodents or not, can transmit diseases.
I think this is a great story to tell, though, because I think when we're in urban or metropolitan environments and we think about prairie dogs, we think of them as rodents and we need to exterminate them, same as other rodents like we just had mentioned. But the reality is, for thousands of years, prairie dogs have been vital to landscapes like this. Do you think it's important for people to learn about prairie dogs and understand why they're a keystone species in beautiful places like this?
Yeah, and I think for success across the West, we need to protect them in more places than just a national park or, national forest or state park. Having more acceptability throughout the ranch lands, which take up the majority of the land out here, is going to be vital for species like black-footed ferrets in the long run.
And we're going to talk about it in a little bit, but also vital to an endangered grassland behind us to be able to survive for, future generations to come and enjoy too. Without prairie dogs, this grassland, potentially would not exist either. I do want to talk about a really cool ecological story that involves prairie dogs and potentially has even been caught here on camera at Petrified Forest National Park. And that's the relationship between coyotes and badgers and how they potentially hunt together and track down prairie dogs.
Yeah, so it's not limited to just prairie dogs, but it's been well documented, and we've caught it on camera, like you said, of coyotes and badgers working together to secure prey. And it's not 100% beneficial to both, but they work together enough that, one gets prey often enough that they see it as helpful to each other. So coyotes will stay on the surface near burrowing animals' holes and kind of put a pressure on the animal to stay in the burrow, while badgers will go in the burrow or dig it out, put in pressure on that animal to leave the burrow, and then kind of whatever choice that animal makes, either the coyote gets it on the surface or the badger gets it underground. It's kind of it is a really cool skill set that they've developed together. Do badgers and coyotes, are they ever a predator or prey towards each other, or are they typically just known to work together in environments like that? I don't have evidence one way or the other, but I would assume coyotes could easily prey on badgers. I've seen coyotes eat things like weasels and other mesocarnivores. I don't know if that would break the trust of the badgers eventually or not. I'm sure it happens sometimes, though.
I want to take a couple of steps back and go back to the prairie dog real quick, because I find this fascinating and how animals work together to accomplish goals inside their communities. You had alluded to it a little bit, but prairie dogs have guards that come up from their holes in their communities and scan for predators, and then they chirp. I think when we're hiking through the Badlands and we hear those chirps, it might just, go through one ear and out the other. We might not think too much of it. But are prairie dogs actively communicating with each other on when it's safe to come out of the burrows, and are they working together as a community?
Yeah, they are. So that's the one thing that sets prairie dogs separate from most other rodents or mammals in the environment is this high communalism. We call it a colony, but that group dynamic that they form. Unfortunately, the Gunnison prairie dog is the least out of the 5 species of that, so we don't see it as much here. But they do all work together to protect each other from prey. They have a series of chirps that is thought to actually be able to indicate whether the predator is coming from the air or the ground, or whether it's like a snake versus a coyote. And so they actually have developed this language that a lot of scientists are just looking into about communicating well more than just like quick dive underground, it's not safe, to actually like look at the sky, there's a predator coming from the sky versus a snake or something. It's pretty cool.
As a biologist, are those the type of stories and the type of research that get you pumped up to put on the uniform and come to work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects of biology. I like seeing success stories of like reintroducing animals into the landscape. So that's one of the things we work on here, is actually translocating prairie dogs from a place like Flagstaff, where a construction project is going to wipe out colony. So it's certain death if they stay there. We actually work with a nonprofit group called Habitat Harmony, who will capture them and transfer them to us, and then we can release them in this landscape. I really like seeing that kind of stuff.
And do you see a high success rate when you do relocate a prairie dog from Flagstaff? Do they easily adapt to this environment?
That's a field we're working on. There's a couple different ways to do it. You can make man-made colonies that are designed to protect them for a little bit before they can go dig their own. We've been working on using old burrows that aren't active anymore to release them into. But there's definitely indications of success. We actually trapped one this year that we had released as a juvenile 2 years ago, which is about their lifespan. So it lived its whole life here.
Final question about the prairie dog before we move into a fascinating species, the pronghorn, and then we want to talk about acoustic monitoring when it comes to bats, and obviously the interplay between a major interstate highway that cuts right through the middle of the park. But how is the trapping process like with prairie dogs? How do you go about trapping them, and do you set up where their communities and colonies are?
Yeah, so trapping depends on what your goal is. So in an area like Flagstaff, where you want to catch as many as you can, as quickly as you can, because that's the efficiency we need, and they're all going to die anyways, you can employ slightly more stressful tactics on them, up to and including potentially pushing them out of the burrow with like water. When we're doing science research here, we're a lot more gentle. We just have traps that have bait in them, and when they go inside, they trigger it. And then we, have to check traps every hour. Usually we're only getting a handful of prairie dogs captured a day, so we can spend the time we need to process them. When we're trapping to translocate here, we're catching about 100 in a week. So it's just a much different process.
Well, I really hope people who are listening to this podcast have a newfound love and respect for prairie dogs. Listening to you speak about them and learning about them has been fascinating, and I'm very excited to go out on a hike and potentially hear them chirping as I walk by. We talked a little earlier about this park being really focused on paleontology. There's fossils of various species that exist here, but one species that is currently alive is the pronghorn, who shows fascinating evolutionary traits. Can you talk about the pronghorn and why it's such a special animal to observe?
Yeah, and thank you for not calling it a pronghorn antelope, as it commonly is called, or an antelope. Common misconception is it's an antelope, and that was because in the 1800s, when the Lewis and Clark expedition came through and described them, it looks like an antelope from the old world and has a pretty similar ecological niche. However, they are most closely related to actually giraffes or okapi, which most people, that's one of my favorite facts to tell people. And you can see some similarities. The pronghorn is known for and named after its horn, which has a forward pointing spike. And that keratinous sheath actually fits over a bone spike, which is actually very similar to how giraffes are. It's more fur than keratin, but it's a very similar thing. They just haven't extended their necks as long. But they're all even-toed ungulates. So in that aspect, kind of similar to the deer family or antelope.
And they are the fastest land mammal in North America. Why did they evolve to become the fastest land mammal?
Yeah, so they're the fastest land mammal in North America, and they're also the fastest land animal in the world over distance. So the African cheetah can run 80 miles an hour. The North American pronghorn has a top speed of about 55 miles an hour for 800 meters, but for 4 miles it can run 35 miles an hour, which is it's incredible to see. But right now, that's way faster than any predators in this landscape. But there's lots of evidence of a North American cheetah that went extinct about 16,000 years ago. So I think Ice Age time frame. And so the North American cheetah was very similar to the African cheetah as a very fast predator. And so they evolved to be able to outrun predators like that.
You mentioned that they're much faster than any mammal around them right now. Have they kind of outgrown or out-evolved their environment?
So that's the thing about evolution, right? Is something's very advantageous until it's not. So have we seen pronghorn slowing down? I don't know that we've been around long enough to see that. But they've also evolved different processes. They're actually the continental U.S.'s longest distance migrant. And they actually are not evolved to nowadays landscape because we've crossed the landscape with roads, fences, and all these hazards that they get tied up into.
You can find pronghorn up at Grand Teton National Park as well. Why is Petrified Forest a good environment for them to thrive?
It's pretty similar to the rest of the grassland habitat throughout the West. We're drier here, maybe less predators. Even though they are so fast, they still get preyed upon, especially as young. An area like this, we don't have the bears or the wolves like Grand Teton does. So you trade some uncertainty with, lack of water, with less predators. It's just kind of a balance that they survive through.
Even in a mountainous environment like Grand Teton and like we talked about earlier, there's badlands and hills behind us. Are they typically on the valley floor where they can survey a larger landscape in front of them?
Yeah, we see them everywhere. Obviously, the food is the grass in the valley bottoms, but because they can travel, 100 miles for these migrations, they cross all the landscapes here.
You mentioned that they're ungulates. Can they climb like maybe a mountain goat that you see? Do they have that same type of ability like, sheep and goats?
Yeah, they're definitely not as agile as sheep and goats, but they do have the even-toed hooves that help give them purchase on specific environments. They're obviously, we talked about how fast they are. They're more specialized for the speed than the evasion into steep cliffs.
You talked earlier about cattle stepping in prairie dog holes and potentially breaking their leg. Could that happen to the pronghorn then? If they're sprinting across the landscape, could they get stuck in one of those holes?
Definitely a possibility, and it has probably happened. But as an evolutionary mechanism, you evolve to see hazards like that and can, avoid them. They're very site oriented because they're in these wide open landscapes. And the sooner you can get running away from a predator, the better. So they use their eyes a lot and would be able to see hazards.
I think that's a really cool example of how national parks are living laboratories. When you step outside of a national park and you set up cattle, in a livestock farm, and they're stepping in these holes and breaking their legs, well, those cattle haven't evolved to that environment or that landscape, right? But you're saying here, because we are in a living laboratory, these animals here have been able to adapt to natural processes.
Yeah. So we actually have a working theory here that we always hear these stories about cattle or horses stepping in prairie dog holes. but we suspect that they're not actually stepping into prairie dog holes. We do have a lot of other rodent burrows here, especially kangaroo rats. And so kangaroo rats will build this mound of dirt with all these holes under it. And when I'm walking across this landscape, I can see a big open hole and know to avoid it. But then you see these kind of dirt mounds, and as soon as you step on it, you collapse and fall up to your knee in it. And every time I step in a hole walking across this landscape, it's in a different kind of burrow, not a prairie dog burrow. Just something that we're, working theory that we have here.
You went there, so I have to ask, because kangaroo rats are another species that show remarkable adaptation to its environment. How come the kangaroo rat has this incredible jumping ability?
Yeah, so there's indications that the kangaroo rat is evolving to very quickly leap out of the way of one of our other major predators here, the rattlesnake. So rattlesnakes are very quick strikers, and kangaroo rats or small mammals are their major prey. So in order to survive this landscape, being able to have that split-second jump ability is key.
Petrified Forest certainly is a place that shows remarkable adaptations across many different species. One project that I know you're passionate about that I want to chat about with you is bat monitoring and how you're able to monitor their echolocation through sound acoustics. Can you talk about that project?
Yeah, so it's an evolving field in biology, is using acoustics for bats. Unfortunately, the need arose about 15 years ago with the introduction of white nose syndrome into North America, which has wiped out 90% or more of some bat species as it moves across the U.S. So there's a quick scramble to do a whole bunch of bat science before we lost the ability to study them because they're not here. So it's an evolving science that's a really cool opportunity. So bats echolocate at night. So they basically yell and the sound goes out and hits something and bounces back, and they can pick it up, and they basically can create this picture of what's in front of them based on the sound. But that creates a unique opportunity in a way to survey them. So sometimes when we're surveying animals, we'll either go look for them visually, or we'll do something like a hair snare trap and collect hair. But for bats, because they're such secretive nighttime flying animals, the sound is actually the easiest way to survey for them. So the physics behind bats' echolocation is really important. They have this ultrasonic call, so it's a higher frequency than humans can hear usually, which presents some challenges in surveying for them. But the nice thing is a lot of the sounds that we hear aren't high enough to be recorded on our equipment. We hear things like cars driving past, and for the most part, a car driving past isn't in that sound range that we're recording. So somewhere from about 20 kilohertz to upwards of 60 or 80 kilohertz is what we're looking at to monitor for bats.
And are you able to dissect the different species based on the scream that you hear?
So Petrified Forest has about 14 species we've identified so far. So being very generalistic, we can tell the majority of the species apart by their call, but some of them have the same frequency and the same characteristics that they're really hard to tell apart. However, the cool thing is when you catch them, a lot of times those species are the ones that are very obviously visually different. Different survey methods are important to tell what's here initially.
One really neat thing with the National Park Service is parks typically share data across different regions. Is this acoustic monitoring something that's happening at other parks, and are you able to share your data with a park around the corner and vice versa?
Across the US and really across the world, as this science comes out, it's a lot of data sharing. The project we're working on specifically was funded for like a 24 park project. So we're coordinating with a researcher from Virginia Tech to do a lot of the analysis work and even a lot of the field work. But we're going to be able to tie together about 24 different parks from the Four Corners region using the same protocol, which is year-round sampling from different specified habitats. And we'll be able to actually look at things like migration patterns across the region through this data set. So yeah, we're only in our first year of recording data. We haven't looked at any of it yet, but I'm super excited to see what we find out through this project.
And based on this data that you receive, are bats good indicators of ecosystem health? If bats are healthy and they're here, is that a sign that the overall ecosystem here at Petrified Forest is healthy?
Yeah, so bats are fairly specialized. Each individual species actually is very specific on what it eats. So we have things like moth specialists or beetle specialists. We actually have a bat species, very common in this park, that will land on the ground and chase scorpions and centipedes. So as an individual species, they can indicate health of very specific things. But as an overall group, like I said, we have about 15 species in the park. And I'm sure we're going to find a few more as this study goes on. Arizona has 24 species in the state. So when you look at it as an overall group, you can start to see ecosystem health through it. The big important thing is bats are actually a huge economic helper. So there's estimates that the insect pests that they eat save agricultural practices billions of dollars a year in, pesticide use and loss of crops and things like that.
Which is obviously just a major benefit to the environment as a whole, getting rid of pesticides, correct?
Yep. Yeah, pesticides. Very useful and necessary in certain uses, but can also be fairly detrimental when used wrong.
You mentioned that bats can be really good indicators of checking ecosystem health of very specific insects and creatures. Is there a different species in the park that gives you a more holistic view of the overall ecosystem here?
Yeah, so generally amphibians are a great ecosystem indicator. Amphibians, as we probably know or don't remember from biology classes, they have a mandatory aquatic phase as basically egg and young. So when we think about things like tadpoles, so they have to have water, and they also live on land as most adults. And so they indicate multiple ecosystems. They also have very permeable skin, so they're really sensitive to things like pesticides. So we use amphibians as a very broad ecosystem indicator. Yeah.
One thing I find very interesting about this park when it comes to wildlife and biology is there's a major interstate highway that cuts right through the middle of the park, Interstate I-40. How does that play a role in the wildlife that's in this park? Do you find roadkill often down that highway?
So another great thing about Petrified Forest is its history as a transportation corridor. So modern day, we have I-40 pretty close behind us. We also have a major railway line cut in the park in half. But going back into history, we also had Route 66 coming through the park. We had a lot of the really early transportation routes like the Beale Camel Road. We had the stagecoach line went through here. So we're at this major intersection of all these transportation routes. Unfortunately, today, speeds have gotten higher and faster, and the transportation lines have had a bigger impact as we move more and more people faster throughout the landscape. So we're dealing with I-40 cutting across the park, which is a major 4-lane highway. As major highways are designed, they're designed to limit things like roadkill as much as possible. So we have fences on either side of them, but that doesn't stop everything. So we do get roadkill on the highway, but the bigger impact we see from the railway line and the highway are actually just barriers to movement of animals. So we talk about things like pronghorn migrate in these great distances. Nowadays, they go and they hit these fences and they can't go any further. So we're seeing impacts like that, probably greater than even roadkill. But that's also, I guess, the benefit to a road like I-40 is we do have these great barriers preventing animals from getting on them. The park highway is just a 2-lane road without any barriers. And we do occasionally get some roadkill, especially small animals like rabbits.
Has there ever been a proposal for a land bridge to cross over the top of I-40 for the species here?
Yeah, so it's something we've thought about. It's hard. We don't have the data to show that there would be any major movement of things like pronghorn across the highway for the cost and the effort into building these. The good advantage that we do have is the park road closes at night, and we do have highway bridges going over both of these. So we have a bridge without cars on it all night long, which can act as a corridor for some of these animals.
There's a lot of adverse effects that are damaging ecosystems and wildlife all across the country, not just here, of course, at Petrified Forest, but above all else, is habitat loss the leader in what's, shrinking populations across the country?
Habitat loss is always one of the top couple reasons. It really depends on what species you're talking about. Some species actually benefit with urbanization of things like raccoons increase in population as compared to a landscape like this.
And speaking of habitat loss, that leads us into the environment behind us. This is one of the endangered grasslands. Grasslands used to be abundant in the Southwest and now almost increasingly non-existent. Why is this ecosystem behind us so rare nowadays, and what can we do to protect it?
Yeah, so the grassland here is usually considered a short grass prairie. We're kind of at the intersection of desert grassland. When most people think of grasslands, they think of the Midwest, the breadbasket of the U.S., which was a huge, vast area. And it's not necessarily that they're gone nowadays, but they've been drastically impacted, mostly by things like agriculture, ranching. In some of these areas, like I said, we get about 10 inches of rain a year. We've been in about a 25-year drought. So things like that have big impacts on these areas. The change from grassland to shrubland is one of those things we see as rainfall gets less or more sporadic. So grasses have roots that go down a certain depth, but shrubs can usually go further and tap into those water sources more throughout the year than grasses can. So we see that shift from grassland to more shrubland. Looking out across the landscape like this, you don't see much of a difference because they're both, a couple feet tall. We're also seeing changes from grassland to expansion of pinyon juniper forests, or usually more juniper, and impacts from more trees growing in these landscapes.
I'm sure you hear it all the time when visitors come here and they're disappointed to not see a forest with big, tall trees and petrified trees standing up. But would you encourage visitors to come here to sit and appreciate this grassland behind us and recognize its uniqueness more than just being just grass?
Yeah, I think it presents a pretty cool opportunity. This is actually the first wilderness area in a park, in the very first wilderness bill for National Park Service. You're looking at behind us. So it prevents this great opportunity to go out into this pretty, remote landscape and just experience a different habitat than we're used to when we think about forests or trees, and just kind of be isolated in the sounds and the light changing across the badlands and all the colors changing and stuff.
Are you impressed with the resiliency of this area? You talked about this area being a major intersection of transportation from Route 66 to I-40 today, stagecoaches that came through here. But yet when you look out on the landscape now, it looks pristine and the ecosystem. We talked about prairie dogs, obviously, hopefully rebounding soon. But are you impressed with how much has taken place here from a historical sense and, how it stands today?
So, I think some of that is just being seen with a pretty general eye. When you look up close into the Badlands or the grasslands behind us, you start to pick out things like invasive species that have been introduced. So we do have a large amount of invasive plant species in the park, some of which are pretty dominant, things like tamarisk or Russian thistle or tumbleweed. They're in the park in almost every landscape. So there are slight changes that we don't even know are changes because they've happened over such a long period of time. Things like all the dry washes are becoming more channelized and more inset into their, bigger bank. So we do see changes over a pretty, the last 100 or 200 years. So far, the landscape has stayed pretty similar with these changes, but at some point, there's going to be a pretty drastic change that it can't recover from.
As we begin to wind down this podcast, we are in Petrified Forest National Park, as we've mentioned throughout this podcast. So I do have to ask you, is there any ecology between the petrified wood that's in the park and wildlife species? Is there any interaction between the two?
We do see some. It's fairly anecdotal at this point, but one of our prairie dog colonies, actually, we've kind of seen migrate to an area of petrified wood. And not necessarily the big logs, but all the little wood chips on the ground. And I think that they may be using it as more protective. So it's going to be a lot harder for a coyote to dig through these wood chips than just the sand or mud around it. So we do see things like that. Plants definitely utilize the habitat that the wood makes. We get things like lichens growing on the wood everywhere. And another one we see, if you visit the park and you're at the south end in the summer, it's very common to see collared lizards actually basking on the wood itself. So if you hike the Rainbow Logs Trail in the summer, especially early mornings, we actually think that they have these kind of almost home ranges developed around the different logs that they like to bask on.
And obviously there's an abundance of amphibians and reptiles that exist in this park and that you can find throughout the desert. In this podcast, we talked about some of the conservation stories, like prairie dogs, but are there any reptiles or amphibians you want to mention as we begin to wrap this podcast up that visitors might see or that are ecologically important to this area?
Yeah, so we have a bunch in the park. Most people don't think they're going to find amphibians in a desert park like this, but we have some highly specialized species. Things like spadefoot toads. We actually have 3 different species, but they're desert specialists. They live underground most of the year or multiple years in a row until we get these monsoon rains. And it's either the sound of the rain or the thunder or some indication of these storms that brings them to the surface. They can actually find these very temporary pools of water, whether it's in a wash or a playa that fills up. They breed, lay eggs, and the eggs can hatch into, the eggs hatch, the tadpoles grow, and they metamorph into, 4-legged creatures that can walk on dry land in about a 10-day time span. So it's this super quick transformation that we don't see in most other amphibians. And it's highly specialized and really, really cool. We also have salamanders in the park. The tiger salamander lives in the desert. It utilizes more migration technique. So they'll breed in these longer term pools and they can be found like 5 or 6 miles away from them as adults.
That's fascinating. Well, Dylan, this park is absolutely beautiful, and people might come in with the notion that this is a prehistoric park where you find fossils and talk about dinosaurs, but the truth is there's a lot of life and a lot of tremendous stories with wildlife here in this park. Is there anything else you want to share before we part ways on this episode?
This park has vast biological resources. I'm more of a wildlife biologist, but we haven't even really touched on the plants here today. We have very unique plants, some of which only live in this, county of Arizona, and not much is being done with them. So even though it may not look like, a Yellowstone or a Yosemite, they're still really unique, just kind of these micro spots in the park that you can find that are really, really cool.
One thing we didn't talk about, but I wanted to talk about, and I said that was my final question. I did want to discuss this. Yesterday, you went on a day trip with fellow colleagues out into the Badlands behind us, and got to enjoy the beautiful geology of this park. What is the camaraderie like with your colleagues here at this park? And do you enjoy hiking out into this landscape and taking it all in?
Yeah, so I got to lead a tour for other employees who don't get to go in the backcountry very often. Just based on job duties or the difficulties in traveling through this landscape. It helps, interpreters and our volunteers to get out and see the resource that they're protecting and interpreting every day. So we work together. Interpretive ranger and myself led the hike. We had our paleontologist with us, and he was finding fossils as we hiked along the dry wash. We saw petroglyphs that we took pictures of and sent back to our archaeologist. And so we do have a really close relationship here where we're constantly working with each other. Part of that is just out of need. I'm the only biologist. We only have one paleontologist. We only have one archaeologist. So when we need help, we have to rely on each other. But we also get along really well and like to learn about these other disciplines.
The park ranger world is small, and it's always amazing getting to hear the stories of interactions between fellow rangers and obviously your shared love for the natural world.
Yeah.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much for spending the time to talk about this amazing park and sharing all your insight with us on this episode. Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. Dylan is an incredible biologist, and I really hope you learned a whole lot about the amazing life that's here at Petrified Forest National Park. So if you like this type of content, it'd mean a whole lot to me if you followed or subscribed on whichever platform you're watching or listening on, as it really does help out our podcast. And until next time, safe travels.